Good day. I'm Dr. Russell Minton, and I have taken a task upon myself to try and bring about some information to people who continue to tell me they know all there is to know about the Tuskegee Airmen. Because it's been my discovery in life that a general idea of anything is akin to total ignorance, and most people really don't know anything correct about the Tuskegee Airmen. So I feel obligated to try and correct that to the best of my ability. I am from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and 2 doors down the street from me, where I lived in a suburb of Philadelphia, Ardmore, resided a gentleman named Charles Alfred Anderson, Alf Anderson. And Alf Anderson was a pilot, and Alf Anderson was black. And Alf Anderson, at the time that I knew him, was working on his credentials for a commercial rating in aviation, and he had to build hours of flight time, and he owned an airplane. And the airplane was based several miles from Ardmore, and he would travel past my house on his way to the airport and made the mistake of asking me if I wanted to go, and I was in the car before he got the words out of his mouth. So I got my first aviation instruction from Charles Alfred Anderson. Now, Alf Anderson was, in about a decade after that, made the chief instructor for the Tuskegee Airmen, and from that time till his death was known affectionately as Chief Anderson. And Chief Anderson sort of took me under his wing aviation-wise and coached me and pushed me along, so that the time that I was just barely eligible by age to be enlisted, he worked his education of me and his influence so that I was in on the ground, my ground floor, which was the closing ends of World War II with the Tuskegee Airmen and the Tuskegee training program. Now, many people are firmly convinced that the reason that there was a Tuskegee Airman training program was because Eleanor Roosevelt was such a bleeding heart liberal that she beat Franklin Delano Roosevelt across the ears until he finally gave in and said, "Oh, all right, Eleanor, I'll do it." It's completely erroneous. First of all, the president doesn't have the funds to institute a training program of that sort. Eleanor did, however, have a lot in the formation of, in the course of history. Franklin Roosevelt was a naval advocate. He had been the Secretary of the Navy for Woodrow Wilson, and he was firmly convinced that America's security would lie in a ring or a row of battleships across the Atlantic and another row of battleships across the Pacific. Some of his cronies he had sent to Europe to evaluate the situation and speak to him and advise him, and when they returned, they told him that it was their opinion that the Second World War was coming down the pike, locomotive speed, no one could stop it, and it was not going to be won on the sea, it was going to be won in the air, and America didn't have enough pilots to put one squadron in the air. And Franklin was quite astonished at this information and asked their advice, and they advised him to take funds that he did have available to him and donate them to colleges and universities to establish a civilian pilot training program. And he thought this was a fantastic idea, and he did have funds enough to establish that. and he told Eleanor what he was planning to do. And here's where Eleanor's role first came into being. Eleanor had a very good friend, Mary McLeod Bethune, the founder of Bethune-Cookman College in Florida, and she told Mary what Franklin's plans were. And Mary said, "Oh, Eleanor, I want you to promise me one thing. Promise me you will get Franklin to give some of that money, that funding, to black colleges and universities." And Eleanor said, of course she would, and Franklin did as Eleanor advised, and he therefore gave funds to 5 black colleges for civilian pilot training. There were Howard and Hampton and Tuskegee, Ohio State. I'm having a senior moment. I can't remember the 5 schools now. Virginia, and there's an A&M. I forget the state that goes in front of it. But at any rate, they were the places that got the money, and they established flying programs. Now, Tuskegee, which was in Alabama, had an airport which was called Moton Field, and they wanted to enlarge it because with this money, their aviation activities increased. But they didn't have the funds to do so. But they did have a Roosevelt Foundation endowment, and someone suggested that they should borrow money from that fund to do the improvements on the airport. And to do that, they had to have a meeting of the board of the administrators of the fund, and Eleanor Roosevelt happened to be on the board. So she went to Tuskegee to meet on the decision about loaning money to enlarge the airport, and she saw these aircraft flying about, and she went out and stood alongside the airport and watched the airplanes taking off and landing, and she turned to a gentleman standing next to her and said, "Can you boys really fly these things?" And he said, "Better than anybody else in the world, ma'am." And Eleanor's response was, "Well, then I want to go up and ride in one." It just so happened that the gentleman to whom she was speaking was Charles Alfred Anderson, and he took her up, not in a T-6 train on a military trainer, but in a J-3 Piper Cub, much to the disgust and terror of the Secret Service, who couldn't get in the airplane with her since the Piper Cub is only a 2-seater. But Alf took Eleanor up for a ride, and she enjoyed it very much and returned safely, and was an advocate of flight training at Tuskegee from thenceforth evermore. The training program, however, did not get established, and when Pearl Harbor occurred, most people who wished to enlist in the Air, it was the Air Corps at that time, not the Air Force, under the Army, would go to a recruiting station and enlist, and they would get sent to Randolph Field in Texas to become a fighter pilot. Some of the high-ranking officials in the Air Corps, Hap Arnold being one of the principals, were firmly convinced that black men were not capable of being taught how to fly a complicated piece of equipment like an airplane, and refused to allow them to enlist in the Air Corps. The black media became involved in campaigning, and judges, lawyers, and news people pushed and agitated and annoyed the Congress to no end, so that it finally came to pass that the 2 greatest bigots in the Congress, not any liberals, decided that they were tired of all the brouhaha over this thought, so they were proposing that funds be allocated to establish a training program to train blacks so that they could set to rest once and for all the ridiculous notion that any black was smart enough to be taught how to operate a piece of equipment as complicated as an airplane. So the bill was passed and the funds were established, and the government selected Tuskegee as the place to establish the training program, and their thinking was Tuskegee is so far out in the boondocks that when the program fails, as we're sure it will, no one will ever know it was ever there and ever existed. So the program was instituted in Tuskegee. The military put together a squadron, the 99th Pursuit Squadron, and they started training flight cadets at Tuskegee. The individuals, much to the surprise of everyone in the military except the cadets themselves, passed their training. They graduated and were commissioned second lieutenants. And class after class after class graduated with not one single order on the books as to what to do with them. So they just accumulated themselves, clustered about at Tuskegee. Every morning, more and more well-trained young men woke up, looked out, and saw 200, 250 aircraft filled with fuel, polished and ready to go. So they went out and they flew. And just as most people have seen the later date documentation of Top Gun, they flew airplanes and they flew and became better and better pilots, building experience hours. Now over in Texas, Randolph Field, they were training Caucasian pilots for fighters pilots, and they were so desperate for their use, they were sending them over to Europe to go into combat with 20, 25 hours of flight experience. Tuskegee Airmen, before anybody finally decided, hey, maybe we could do something with these people, had 250, 300, 350 flight hours under their belts and were better, because of bigotry, better pilots than the Caucasian pilots that they were turning out. The Tuskegee Airmen have a reputation. Everybody knows that their claim to fame was they were assigned to fly fighter escort for bombers that were bombing the Axis in Europe, and they never lost a single bomber that they escorted and protected to enemy air action. That's not true. They lost 27, and it's well documented. However, prior to using Tuskegee Airmen to fly protective cover and escort for the 8th Air Force, Hap Arnold was sending B-17 Flying Fortresses in flights of 100 aircraft, and there were 10 men in each aircraft, and the Luftwaffe was shooting down 60 of them each day on their raids because there were no fighter escort that could, with the range to reach and stay with them. And contrary to what Boeing had told the military, they thought that the Flying Fortress was so heavily armed that when they were in tight formations, fighter planes wouldn't be able to attack them. But this didn't prove to be true. When finally they decided to allow the Tuskegee Airmen to go into combat situations, the airplane that they gave them to fly was a Curtiss P-40. And everyone has seen a picture of the P-40 that was used in China with the flying tigers. It has a shark mouth painted on the sides. Well, when the Pearl Harbor occurred, the government pulled all of the flying tigers out of China, and they took those airplanes and they took them back to the United States, and they refurbished them, cannibalized them, put them together, and they took sometimes as many as 10 airplanes to put together to get one that was, again, intact. And that was the aircraft that was given to the Tuskegee Airmen to fly. One of the early trainees, Hiram Mann, explained to me how they were trained to fly the P-40. They were given a manual and they memorized it. Then they were allowed to sit in this airplane and they had to touch each button and knob and control in the aircraft. And then they were blindfolded and had to repeat this and do this all correctly and accurately. Then they were allowed to start the engine, and their instructor knelt on the wing walk, and they fired up the engine and they began to taxi the airplane, and they would taxi it faster and faster until finally they got it up, the tail up and the plane just on the main gear. And if they could control it properly, the instructor then said, okay, shut it down. He slipped off the wing and said, take it up, fly it. They had more casualties as a result of this method of training from the training program than they did from combat. But then they decided to allow the Tuskegee Airmen to be shipped overseas, but they still couldn't bring themselves to put them into a combat situation. They put them on desert patrol, and their patrol area was North Africa, between Libya and Egypt. And after they had been there for 6 weeks, the bigots who were very, very closely following them in Washington said, see, we told you those guys were worthless. They've been overseas now for 6 weeks and they haven't shot down a single enemy aircraft. Well, there wasn't a single enemy aircraft within 600 miles of them, fortunately, because the P-40 was obsolete in 1939. And it was no match for the German fighter planes of the time. However, the greatest contribution that the Tuskegee Airmen made to the military effort, you just don't see anybody admitting. You've all heard of how Field Marshal Montgomery defeated Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, who was sent by Hitler with German tanks, and every time he met with Montgomery, Montgomery defeated him. This is absolutely untrue and not documented anywhere. Hitler sent Erwin Rommel and 800 Panther tanks into Africa through Tripoli, and his mission was to go through Libya, cross over and capture Alexandria in Egypt, then Cairo and the Suez Canal, and then go into the Middle East and capture the Middle East oil fields. Now, had he been successful in accomplishing this task, most of us who are English speaking today would be speaking German. However, every time Montgomery met up with Rommel, Rommel defeated him. The first time any Americans saw combat in World War II was under Montgomery at Kasserine, and he used his tactics of charging into Rommel, and the Americans were crucified. And it wasn't until George Patton came in and took over the command that Americans survived a battle with the Germans. But the Tuskegee Airmen were given the next most wonderful, read that as terrible, fighter plane. It was called the Bell Airacobra, the P-39. It was a terrible fighter plane, but it had a cannon in the nose, and it was found to be a formidable anti-tank weapon. So when the Tuskegee Airmen were flying patrols across North Africa, they would run across Rommel and his Panther tanks, which were the most formidable armored weaponry the world had ever seen. The time that Rommel got to El Alamein in North Africa, he had 44 tanks left of the 800 that he had arrived with. And he realized that it was impossible for him to capture Alexandria, Cairo, and the Suez Canal, and he turned about and retreated and went back through North Africa, through Libya, to Tripoli, to Sardinia, and it was the farthest that the Nazis ever extended their conquest of Europe, and it was due to the Tuskegee Airmen destroying the tanks that Rommel had been commanded to conquer Africa with. If you read about the utilization of the Bell Era Cobra, it is listed as a formidable anti-tank weapon which the Russians proved in the battle for Stalingrad. But it was only after the Tuskegee Airmen had utilized it to stop Rommel that the Era Cobras were taken and given to Russia to defend against the German tanks in the Eastern Front. Tuskegee Airmen then were finally realized to be of some value in the use of an airplane, so those who still had P-40s remaining were assigned to assist in the invasion of Sardinia. They were assigned to an infantry group. Unfortunately, infantry commanders didn't have much of an idea what to do with an airplane, and they kept giving them orders to do things that really couldn't be accomplished with an airplane. So finally, Tuskegee Airmen came to the infantrymen and said, why don't you take one of the pilots, one of us, let him go up front with the infantry and have the infantry people describe to the pilot what it is that you want done, and let the pilot convey the information to the squadron. And they said that we'll give it a try. They gave it a try, and it worked so well. It's the way the Air Force works today. They have a forward observer who's a pilot. Was thought up and utilized by the Tuskegee Airmen. The Tuskegee Airmen first received a escort the bombers mission for medium bombers over an area in Poland called Ploesti, which was oil fields, and they discovered that they were very adept at escorting the bombers. In the meantime, there was still much to do about nothing back home, and they were seriously considering shutting down the Tuskegee experiment, as it was called in those days. The commandant, B.O. Davis, went back to Washington and fought for his buddies, his guys, his boys. And he managed to convince a few people that if we got some decent airplanes, perhaps we could be worthy of our presence in the war zone. And miraculously, the request was honored. The Tuskegee Airmen's P-40s and P-39s were removed, and for the first time, they received the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, which was a up-to-scale fighter aircraft and was assigned to escort bombers that were bombing daily in the daytime in Germany and France. B.O. Davis returned from Washington, having been successful in his advocacy, and his instruction to the Tuskegee Airmen were, you now have one mode in life, and that is to save the crews of the bombers. So if I see or hear of one pilot breaking away from the bombers to chase off after fighters to get to be an ace, I will personally see that he digs latrines for the rest of the time that he's in the military. The threat was well received, and the thing that the Tuskegee Airmen became noted for, as far as the bomber pilots was concerned, was they stuck with the bombers and they protected them, such that when things were really getting tough and tight and they learned that they were going to be sent into Germany, they requested that they be escorted by those guys who were flying those red-tailed airplanes. They didn't know that those guys flying those red-tailed airplanes were black, but they wanted them because they knew they stuck with the bombers. And that was how the reputation developed as to being on the scene and protecting the bombers better than anybody else had been doing. The P-47, however, had a terrible problem. It could pass anything in the air except the gas station. They couldn't put enough fuel in it for it to accompany the bombers all the way into Germany. And the Luftwaffe knew almost to the inch exactly how far the P-47s could go, and they clustered about a yard beyond that point and waited for the P-47s to have to break off and go back home to refuel, and then began to decimate the bombers. About this time came about another very fortunate thing. The RAF flew an aircraft called the Spitfire, which was probably one of the best propeller-driven fighter planes in the war up to that time. They did not have enough money in England to continue to repair Spitfires and do research and development on a new model of fighter plane. So the Brits sent out a request to America: could any American aviation designers come up with a fighter plane that could be a replacement for the Spitfire? And an organization called North American, on the back of an envelope, had one of their designers come up with an aircraft that they titled the Mustang. It had an entirely new concept. It had a laminar flow wing which cut the drag in half and increased the speed. And the Brits read the statistics and the performance and said, this sounds very interesting. And 8 examples were crafted and shipped over to England. And they were taken to an airfield in Great Britain called Biggin Field, which happened to also be a Spitfire base. And Spitfires used to come in periodically for engine overhauls, or the turnabout. They would, after a certain number of hours of flight, they'd pull the engine and put another one in. 8 of these Mustangs were on the scene at this time, and the Brits loved them. They were very, very formidable in their acrobatic ability, maneuverability, until they climbed above 8,000 feet, at which time they couldn't get out of their own way, and they discovered it was because they had Packard engines in them which were not supercharged. And they, oh no, this will not do. We have to have a fighter plane that can go up to 25,000, 30,000 feet. Take them apart and pack them up and send them back to America. Well, one of the very fortunate happenstances was about to occur in one of the hangars where they were disassembling the Mustangs. They were also installing new engines in the Spitfires. And the Spitfires were powered by a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The Spitfires were in to have engine turnover, and the Mustangs were having their Allison engines pulled so that they could be disassembled and packed and sent back to America. Fortuitously, the mechanics looked at the 2 engines and said, it looks like this Merlin might fit in that Mustang. Now, it so happens that the Merlin was twin supercharged, and when they put that engine into the Mustang, suddenly they had what turned out to be the most formidable single-engine propeller-driven fighter plane that the world had ever seen, the P-51 Mustang with laminar flow wings, decreased drag, and high performance all the way up to 25,000 feet. Armed with that formidable weapon, the bombers now had the capability of escort all the way to their targets and back. There was one small problem, however, that still persisted. The Mustangs came out of the factory with two 75-gallon drop tanks. That's extra fuel in bomb-shaped canisters under the wings. And with the calculations being done for the fuel requirements to escort the bombers all the way to Berlin, they discovered that even with the wonderful performance of the Mustang, there was not enough fuel to be able to go all the way and all the way back. But since everyone in the Tuskegee Airman squadrons had been flying P-47 Thunderbolts, which had 110-gallon drop tanks, they said if we could get some Thunderbolt drop tanks, we could jury-rig them to fit the Mustangs, and then we could make the trip. So they put the word out, could we borrow Thunderbolt fuel tank, drop tanks, please? And all of a sudden, all of the Thunderbolt drop tanks disappeared. No one could find them anywhere. So then another strange disappearance occurred on the afternoon prior to the planned raid on Berlin. All of the 3/4-ton vehicles and M1 carbines disappeared from armories all over Italy. And that night, 3/4-ton vehicles with aviation mechanics armed with M1 30 caliber carbines started showing up at Thunderbolt bases, and Thunderbolt drop tanks started appearing and disappearing into the 3/4-ton vehicles. They also discovered a large depository of P-47 drop tanks that was in a warehouse in a railroad yard, and they were all labeled as part of a railroad line, so that when they started showing up on the P-51 base, the rumor got out that the crew chiefs had gone out and robbed a train to get the necessary fuel tanks. But all night long, the crew chiefs worked on those aircraft so that by morning, every Mustang had a high-volume set of drop tanks. They worked fantastically well. It took the Mustangs all the way to Berlin and back. One of the flight leaders, his name was Wade Watts, was flying a contingency of Mustangs. The higher echelons of the Air Corps learned about this terrible conduct and sent the word out. All of those borrowed fuel tanks had better be returned to the Thunderbolt bases after this mission is over. And of course, the concept and the order didn't go very well together, since what these things were called were drop tanks, and the concept was if you were in combat, you would drop them to increase your performance. So there was a few unkind words said about that order. But Wade Watts was known to be a very aggressive pilot, and he was one of the ones who first sighted Luftwaffe fighter planes approaching the bombers and gave the order, drop the tanks. And he pulled the lever on his Mustang, and only one tank dropped. And his squadron mate said, Wade, go drop out and go home. You can't stay in combat with one tank with all that drag. The plane's going to be trying to fly sideways. Way discovered that with that drag, he was able to make turns tighter than any of the German fighters, as long as he made a turn to the left. And he was able to shoot down 2 fighter planes, and he returned to base with 1 empty drop tank. And he said he was complying with the order to bring back the tanks as best he could, and there was 1 there, you could go out and have it. Also, the Tuskegee Airmen were the first to encounter jet fighter planes. The Germans were so terrified of the American bombers that they brought the Messerschmitt 262, which was a jet-propelled airplane, had not very much range, but a top speed 100, 110 miles faster than the Mustang. Mustang's top speed was 450 miles per hour, and the Messerschmitt 262 had 500 plus mile per hour range, speed range, but not much ability to stay up because it burned a lot of fuel very quickly. So since the Germans knew the route that the bombers would be flying, they built bases for their jet fighters directly under the route that the bombers would be flying. So although the Mustang couldn't catch up to one of these jets, they had to slow down to 150 miles an hour to land, and that's when they were encountered by the Tuskegee Airmen and shot down in a goodly number. The war in Europe did not last much longer than that, and I think the most disheartening portion of service to the military as a Tuskegee Airman came about when repatriation occurred, and the pilots were put on board a troop carrier, sailed back to the United States, heard the anchor drop, and was time to disembark, and were confronted with 2 great signs, arrows pointing to the left and to the right, that said white and colored. It was very difficult to accept that the military was sending folk back home who had passed every possible test could be encountered and proven worthy until they got back to where they had set out from to begin with, and once again were declassified and discharged as segregated individuals. There was a cadre of Tuskegee Airmen who never flew single-engined fighter planes. They were trained as multi-engine pilots, as bombardiers, and as navigators. And for some reason or another, they were never, ever sent into combat. They flew B-25 bombers, which is the airplane that was made famous with the 30 seconds over Tokyo situation, that they put them on a carrier and flew them out as close to Japan as they could, and they bombed Japan. They were moved from one base to another all over the United States. They were never in Tuskegee. And the culmination of that group of pilots was known as the Ferguson Few, they went to an air base where they were based and wanted to go to the officers' club to have a steak and a drink, as most officers did in most bases. And when they went to the officers' club, they were told they couldn't be admitted to it. And the explanations that were given to them were all sorts of gobbledygook, but the real reason was they were black and nobody on the base was going to allow them to be served in the Caucasian bar. The members of the Tuskegee Airman group were not quite pleased with that, so they assembled and said they were bound and determined they were going to enter. The provost marshal was called, MPs came out armed with machine guns, and there was supposedly some jostling that occurred, and the bottom line of all of that was 101 flight officers were jailed. It just so happened that then President Harry Truman was made aware of the situation, and he had been following black aviation ever since Alf Anderson first flew a transcontinental flight in an airplane titled the Booker T. Washington, when then Senator Harry Truman said, "You guys really must have a lot of guts to fly one of those things all the way across the country and back." And he contacted the Attorney General and said, "You get those guys out of that jail situation," which he did. As it turned out, all but one of those pilots was not exonerated, but the charges were all dropped. Unfortunately, the one jostler was convicted of insubordination, and his criminal record was not expunged until about 10 years ago. I think it may have been posthumously, but he did have all the charges dropped and he was returned to rank, so that it took a long time, but he was finally forgiven. So contrary to another, what everybody knows fact, the civil rights struggle was not started in 1960. It wasn't Rosa Parks. It was the Tuskegee Airmen who began the fight visibly to prove that the ability to operate a complicated piece of equipment is not limited by pigmentation of the skin.